Hi, FYS. I am Carrie Menold. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm a geology professor here and also on the FYS committee. And what I wanted to share with everybody is something that was going to be in our May workshop, but obviously we weren't able to do it that way. So there's a few pieces of this that are much better when we're able to do interactive work, and obviously we can't. So I'll do my best to kind of explain how those work and how that would tie into what I'm going to talk about. I also need to give full credit to the group that taught me this. Last December, I did an all-day workshop that was organized through an educational branch of the sort of geology community, and it's based out of Carleton College. And they sort of sponsored this workshop that was run by CEPL, which you can see the logo there. CEPL is a educational research group based out of San Francisco State, and the work I'm presenting is from them, and they have a website and lots of other information and other cool things they've done, not just the part I'm going to share with you. So I'd just like to acknowledge them and how much of this is really coming from their work. And in fact, I'll be sharing resources with you from them. So if you're interested in teaching pedagogy and how students learn and how their brains work, this is the kind of work that CEPL is doing. It is definitely extends beyond science. So if you're interested in this stuff, don't be put off by the fact that it is sort of says it's science education. A lot of the work that they're doing really translates, I think, across all disciplines. So I'm going to present this stuff that they did on equity in the classroom. I found it really helpful implementing it last semester, and so I'm going to share that with you. So anyway, what I'm hoping that you guys get from this for your classes is experience and sort of information about how we've unintentionally sometimes have unstructured classroom environments, and I'll define what that is. And when we do that, it tends to work against our goals of inclusiveness, fairness, and equity. So we're going to sort of talk about what unstructured classrooms look like, with obviously the goal then to be creating structured classrooms. And then the goal will be for you at the end that you can self-assess your current awareness of this issue, of your classroom dynamics, whether they're structured or unstructured. And then there's going to be strategies that you can use in your classrooms to promote equity, fairness, and inclusion. So hopefully you guys find this helpful. So let's get started. Okay, yay. So I just want to explain a little bit about the part that we were going to do in person. And there's a really classic exercise on equity and inclusion that is called the Building Mobiles exercise. And it sounds like exactly what it is. You're building a mobile, like, sort of a balanced hanging thing. And the way that this works is that when you would show up to your workshop or wherever you are, you would be introduced to each other. You would have kind of that usual kind of intro dynamic. And then you would just jump right in this, and the organizers would ask you to look under the table, and under the table you would find a paper bag. And inside your paper bag there would be stuff. And you would be assigned in your near environment sort of people that you were sitting next to. They would say, okay, build a mobile. What's in the bag? That's what you've got. Go. And then everyone starts building. And you're only given a short amount of time, like 5 minutes. So you've got to open that bag and just do it. And so what happens is that people just start going, right? And very, very quickly, certain people in the room notice something, which is that the bags aren't the same. So in some bags, there's a lot of stuff like tape and glitter glue and colored paper and hangers and all sorts of stuff and string. And then in some bags, there's literally like a piece of paper and a hanger with no glue, no tape, no nothing. So they're really disparate sort of things in each bag. And in 5 minutes, right, you sort of go through and you're trying to do the best you can. And then everyone's mobiles are sort of shown off, right, and critiqued. And what it's trying to get at, right, is that almost immediately, if you have a bag that's only got like 2 things in it, you are aware of that. You're looking around, like, how can I make a mobile out of this? You start to look around the room and you notice people with scissors and glue and tape and string. And you're like, whoa, I don't have all that stuff in my bag. And so it's pretty powerful, right? And so the other really interesting thing we'll get at is that the people with really full bags with lots of stuff, they're so engrossed in making their really beautiful mobile. And there's often the groups that have the most stuff make the most cool mobiles, right? Because they have all this stuff and they're cutting things out and it's just really beautiful. And the glitter glue is the prize item. They often have that as well. They make sparkly, amazing mobiles, and they're completely unaware that there are other tables with less stuff. And this is sort of a real world moment to sort of experience what some of our students are experiencing in the classroom, which is that some of them are walking into that room feeling like they have less resources than others, and what's in that bag is really different for some students versus others. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but often the students who have the most resources are very unaware of these dynamics. And if we think about us as PhDs, often maybe we were students with a lot of resources, right? Our bag was very full. And so thinking about awareness of sort of how students are, where they're coming from and what they have is a really important piece in sort of creating equity in the classroom. So that awareness and the assumption of what's in the bag, right? That's also really important. So we're going to talk about that. And if you're interested in this exercise, it's really powerful. Even if you know what's coming, it's really still really powerful. It makes you feel a lot of feelings. It's interesting. I really learned a lot from doing it, and I was really hoping to do it with all of you. So I'm sorry that didn't happen. But anyway, if you're interested, you can see here there's two papers that sort of describe this. And if you're interested in more about that and you want to read about those, I just wanted to include those references for you. So I'll kind of refer back to this. And obviously, ideally, we would have done this, and then I would be talking about the next steps, but we couldn't. So hopefully that makes sense. If anyone wants to talk to me more about it or has questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to try to talk more about it. Okay, moving on. So sorry this was canceled. All right, so if you think about our resource bag that we would have had under the table, right? Another thing we can do is think about, well, what would those resources look like for our students, right? What does it mean when they're coming in the classroom? And again, if we were in person, we might have just been able to crowdsource this list, right? And so the group that I was with crowdsourced a list in just a few minutes, and we came up with a super long list of things that could be considered resources that students may or may not have that they'd be bringing into the classroom. So you can kind of see, I'll flip to the next slide, and you can see what that would look like. And you can see that, like, just in our short sort of, we came up with this big list, right? And you can imagine, right, this is stuff that we don't necessarily know our students have or don't have, right? They may be working a huge amount outside the classroom. They may have mental health challenges. They may have confidence issues. They may be bringing in attitudes or concerns about the topic, right? They may think that they're not good at science, or they may think that they're not good writers, and that sort of fear and that lack of confidence is going to impact things. They may not have access to technology. They may have a real hard time asking for help, right? They may be bringing in all sorts of things that will make them feel more safe and secure, sort of have more confidence and be ready than other students. So just be really aware. There's so many different ways that our students sort of come in with sort of a full or less full bag, and they're very aware personally of these things. And so maybe you can think back to your own experience as a student, sort of when you had those kinds of feelings. In my case, my parents didn't go to four-year university. And so I remember feeling really powerfully that I was missing something, and I knew there was information I didn't have. And I was very aware of that as a student, for example, and as a first-year student. I never expressed that to anybody out loud, right? But I was very aware that I was missing things, and I didn't know how to find them out. And so I think a lot of our students have, in all sorts of ways, bringing those kinds of things into play. So maybe sometimes maybe putting yourself in their shoes, or trying to remember how it felt to be a student, that most of the time they're not conveying the lack of these things to you, right? So it's up to us to kind of create classroom environments where they feel comfortable and that, like, we can sort of deal with these issues directly. Okay, so part of this is awareness. And so how do we build awareness? And so I kind of talked about some of this stuff, but how aware are you of what resources bring to the classroom? How aware are you of our student body, of sort of what those issues are? And a lot of you are very aware, but paying attention to those things, right? Not necessarily asking them to detail all of the things that they think they're bringing or not bringing, but sort of being really aware that our students are bringing in very mixed and different experiences. Being also aware that the students may or may not be very aware of each other, right? That they're also making assumptions about what resources they have as compared to their peers, right? They don't always understand or are aware of sort of the discrepancies in those resources. I will say, though, that the students with the most resources tend to be the most unaware, and the students with the least resources tend to be the most aware of these issues. So what you'll find is the students who are the most prepared or have the most resources will be the least aware of these kinds of issues. And the students who have the most sort of challenges and things that they're sort of worried about, those students tend to be very, very aware of these things and are bringing those worries into the classroom. And then, like I said, I think it's really valuable for us to sort of imagine how that felt. And the mobile exercise does a really good job of sort of bringing those feelings to the fore. You know, when I did it, it was a whole group of people who are passionate about these issues and have taken lots of workshops and thought a lot about it and read a lot about it. And in the moment of making the mobiles, all of us, depending on what bag we got, were in the role that we assigned. And we were the people with a lot of resources were oblivious. People with very few were very, very aware and very upset about it. And it was like, you know, we all ended up in those roles despite all being educators who are sort of very aware of these issues. So it was a powerful exercise. I'm sorry that we didn't get to do it, but I think that awareness piece is really important, just sort of being always aware of where students are coming from. And so the goal for this next half of this little presentation is going to be to try to get us thinking about those things. Okay. So how do we structure learning environments to promote fairness, equity, and access for all students? How do we do that? First of all, we have to define what we mean by unstructured learning environments. And unstructured learning environments, the mobile experience is actually designed to be an unstructured learning environment, right? You were just given a task and said, do it. There wasn't any instructions about how to do it. It was just do it. And what you had, and you just had to do it. That's a classic example of an unstructured learning environment. Another thing might be if you give a short prompt for a paper and say, okay, write it. Or another one might be that you hand out a quantitative homework and then say it's due tomorrow, right? These kinds of things, right? Where we sort of just give them their thing to do and then say, do it. Or maybe there's a quiz and we just hand it out and say, take it, right? Those kinds of things can be really unstructured. And when we are dealing with unstructured environments, that's what leads to these feelings can lead to unfairness, these feelings of exclusion, and it can be really dissettling, and it can kind of create classrooms where we are sort of unintentionally creating inequities. One thing to be aware of, I took some notes. I want to make sure I said some things here, so let me just make sure I'm dealing with these. I know that one of the big pieces here is that as educators, we're bringing a lot of assumptions into play. And so I think one thing that we can do to try to sort of think about unstructured versus structured classrooms, right, is that are we making assumptions about what they should or shouldn't be able to do? Are we communicating those assumptions to students, right? And so what we'll see is the difference between the unstructured, which is in red here, and a structured classroom. If we add structure, what we're doing is we're essentially going to add explicit content, right? So we're going to make explicit the things that were assumed. And so people often talk about unstructured classrooms as having invisible rules, right? An invisible rule would be you got that math assignment and you were then just supposed to do it, right? And some of the invisible rules would be like, oh, well, you had to look up this, or you had to know where in the textbook to find it. You would know that office hours were available and that all questions were welcome, right? All these things, but none of those were stated, right? You just said, here's your homework, it's due tomorrow. Whereas a structured classroom, right, there you might spend a few minutes discussing the assignment. You might talk about how many points it's worth, why it's important to their learning, how it's going to fit into the class goals. You would discuss office hours and say, okay, so when you get stuck, this is what you should do. This is how you can get help, right? All these kinds of things where you're making explicit all of the sort of unspoken rules, right? Whereas a lot of times the students who sort of are achieving high marks in your class without needing all of this additional support, you often know, okay, I'll go here and do this and I'll get help here and blah, blah, blah. Okay. So the goal is that you're going to still give the same assignments, but you're adding structure to sort of try to eliminate some of these inequities so that students who are sort of having a harder time understanding what's supposed to happen and why and what your role is and what their role is in your classroom, that's all explicit and how the grading's going to work and all these other things. So saying out loud things, another way to think about it is just being transparent, right? You should be able to always say why you're doing what you're doing, how it impacts your course evaluation and assessment, right? And how it fits into your broader goals for the course. So you should be able to always discuss those things. And those should always be something that the students know. So when they know why they're doing what they're doing and what it's for. And I think students really like that, and it helps them feel more secure and understanding of what the effort that they're putting in, what is it for, and how am I going to learn, and how is this going to impact my standing in the class. So the way I would put this is just to make your classroom more structured, you're just trying to make explicit assumptions. So instead of just making these assumptions that students know how to do X or Y, you're trying to be explicit about that and make it really, really clear. Okay, so hopefully I was clear in that explanation. All right, so if we summarize what I just said, a lot of words, right? We are trying to move away from assumptions that students are lacking, because when we make assumptions that they know how to do things and then they don't do them well, right? Now they feel, we often make sort of great assumptions and other things about their effort and intent when they don't do something well, right? So we've made assumptions about what they should be able to do if in an unstructured classroom, and then if they don't do it well, we then often not make additional assumptions about their sort of how much they're trying, or what the quality of their work was, right? And so we ascribe a lot of negative sort of words to them, right? So if they don't meet our assumptions, then they're somehow lacking, okay? So unstructured classrooms lead a lot to this, right? Where students do poorly, and why, right? And is it their fault, or is it the fault of our learning environment that we've created? Okay, so what we're trying to move towards is the idea that adding structure will then force us to look at our own teaching and how we do it and say, actually, okay, so if I'm hoping for increased level of engagement, of student success, and I want all students to feel like that is reachable for them, right? How do I do that? Well, I have to add structure. And when I add structure, I can then look at my own teaching, my own sort of classroom dynamics, my own sort of description of assignments, my own syllabus, and say, okay, well, what's missing? What's missing to make sure that students know those invisible rules, that the rules are made explicit? So the idea is we go through and we try to find places where we could be clearer, we could make things clearer for students, and they could understand why we value what we value, what tools they will need to complete assignments. So it's sort of becoming, I say, like, okay, well, where's the problem? Maybe the problem's with me and how I'm doing things, and maybe I could be more clear and transparent, and the students then will able to rise to those challenges and learn and feel comfortable learning in that environment. Okay. It's weird not having you guys here, by the way. Okay, so what this workshop presented, which I thought was really helpful, and I'll go through these not one by one, but what they presented was these 21 ideas or strategies that help add structure to a classroom. And they cover lots of different areas. And so the nice thing about this is this list is like, you're like, wow, too much. I just included this so you can kind of see some of the things that are on here. And a lot of these I know people do. All right, think pair share at the top there. Tons of us do that. Allow students time to write in class. That happens all the time. We are doing a lot of these things, but maybe we're not doing them with this in mind, right? And so it's not that we're not doing some of these things, but maybe we're not doing these things often enough, or we're not thinking about all these different ways. Then what I'm going to give you guys, or what you might have already seen accompanying this video, is that one of the conveners of this workshop, she wrote a pedagogy paper about this very topic, and in it, she goes through tons and tons of details about these things. So you can kind of learn why each of these sort of promotes equity in the classroom. But it's nice to have this list. So the idea isn't that you do all 21, but that you try to think of your assignments, your classroom sort of dynamics, and think, well, which of these could I start adding, and in what parts of my classes, so that I can sort of add equity to my classroom in multiple ways. And so it's not like you have to do each of these once in your semester, but the idea is, how do you add these strategies to your teaching and make them a part of your teaching in all ways, right? And so that's sort of the idea. So how do we do this? One thing that I think is really helpful with a big list like this is, before you go any further, what I want you guys to do is pause the video, and I want you to read through the list. And you got this list of 21 as a separate file, Word document, or PDF. So open that up and look at it, and try to mark off which ones you are unfamiliar with the question mark, and the ones that you're familiar with the check. So this first pass, you're just trying to say, like, I've heard of this, or I've never heard of this, and kind of work your way through that. And you can pause and we'll come back. Okay, so I assumed you unpaused. So what you've done now is you've figured out which ones you know about, maybe you haven't used a lot, maybe which ones you've used a ton, and then which ones you've never heard of. So if you have a bunch with question marks, I would highly recommend you go check out the paper. So it's I included it in the email, or Matt did. And so you can look at each of these strategies has a paragraph that talks about sort of what is the logic behind that and why does it promote equity in the classroom. So if you have any that have question marks by them, even the ones you checked off, you can have a look at that and hopefully that will give you some additional insight. Okay, so the second phase of this, right, is okay, now you've hopefully checked a lot of these, you know about these. These are strategies you've heard about in other contexts. Maybe you've heard about it in terms of active learning, things like this, but these are all things that also help promote classrooms where students feel more comfortable and are addressing some of these issues of sort of disparate amounts of sort of resources coming in. Another thing that you can do, and if you flip that sheet over, you'll notice there's a second side. And on that second side, you have the same list of 21. But what I want you to do this time is I want you to go through that list of 21. And I want to record the following information. Have I never used the strategy? Have I occasionally used the strategy? Do I regularly use the strategy? And is this a strategy I'm really interested in? So now that you've gone through and you've learned all about these, now let's try to figure out how many of these you've used a lot, used a little, never used, and are really interested in adding, right? And so this can give you sort of a starting point to say, okay, so of this list of 21, which are the ones I'm already using, but I can now think about them in the context of this idea of equity and fairness? Which ones have I never used? And which ones might I actually be really interested in adding to my arsenal of teaching tools? So it's a really useful thing because instead of just being sort of random about it, once you've identified those ones that you use, sometimes a lot, and that you would really like to add that you haven't used before, it's a really useful thing. So then you can go through your syllabus or your sort of think about your in-class activities and sort of say, okay, well, what would be good opportunities for me to use 25? Wait, that's not one. Excuse me. 17. 4. All right. So the idea is to sort of think about this list in a way that will help you sort of utilize it, right? And the goal isn't necessarily to check every box. Like I said, the goal is to think about which ones will suit you and your teaching and your class and the way that you use your class. You may find that for your FYS, there'll be some that you're going to use a lot, but you might use a different set for a 200 level class or for an introductory survey course or for an upper division seminar type course. You may end up finding that you use different ones in different contexts. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful. I think that like a lot of these kinds of things, right? It's sort of being awareness of an issue is the most important piece. And then trying to think it through in terms of how can I help create that environment in my classroom. The big takeaways I hope that you have is that you sort of are more explicit with your students about those rules, those assumptions, so that they know what you're thinking. And that will make them feel more comfortable asking for help. And you can sort of help them see where that help is and that it's freely available and that you all are very helpful. So it's something that they should know and that they can take advantage of, right? And if they trust that you are transparent, there's no tricks, that the deck is not stacked against them, that they can then be more effective in your classroom. So I would like to all of you just think about maybe how this might help you guys and what it might do in your classroom. And then, like I said, now that you've kind of worked through that list, hopefully you can find some of these things that you think will help you with your teaching in FYS. If anyone has any questions about this, if it wasn't clear or if you would like a little bit more information from me, I'm happy to elaborate more. Even we could create a little Google Meet to talk more about these ideas or implementing the strategy. So if people are interested in something like that, let me know. And like I said, again, this is definitely not my work. It was something that was shared with me and I found really helpful. It made me think a little differently about how I ran discussions, how I ran participation points. It made me think about how I graded things and how much of my grades were going towards for things like in-class participation and all of these kinds of things, attendance. It made me rethink a lot of things. That was very, very valuable. And I think it helped my class dynamic tremendously. So if anyone wants to talk more, like I said, I'm happy to, and hopefully it's good luck with everybody planning your semester. I know that I'm not ready yet. So hopefully you guys are getting there. I'm getting there, but I'm definitely not ready yet. All right. Bye-bye.